the U.S. support for Israel was overwhelming. Today we've seen it drop down. I mean, now it's less than 50% of Americans want to support Israel. That Russia gains from the war in Israel today in three different ways.
This is a Visegrad24 series about the Israel-Hamas war.
Welcome, Jason J. Smart. You're with us today to share some of your knowledge from the world of Russian propaganda. And in general, you're a political scientist who has great expertise in the Soviet Union and post-Soviet states. And of course, it seems that there is no conflict today in which the Russians don't meddle, at least to some degree. And the war in Gaza between Israel and Hamas, it seems that there are some Russian traces as well, even though they might be going through Iran more than directly. But also we have seen some Hamas operatives that have been visiting Moscow in recent years. How strong would you say that this link is?
Well, the link is very strong, and it's very important to understand whenever we see something nefarious going on, for instance, when we're talking about Iran, or we're talking about Russia, or what the relationship is to the situation today here in Israel. The fact is, it's not just an isolated incident. Israel is a symptom of what's going on globally. Russia is operating, as it is in this case here, operating also in Ukraine, using Iranian drones. It's using North Korean technologies as well. They're also operating in Latin America. We know that Iran works with Russia in Latin America. It works with Venezuela, works with Nicaragua, works with other countries. They work with drug cartels in Latin America. Russia's influence globally and its partnership, its business partnership with Iran is something that stretches around the globe. So one element of that we do see very clearly here in Israel is what is going on with the terrorist organizations attacking the state of Israel. But that is just part of a larger picture of how Russia forges partnerships that are also blacklisted from the international economy. They're also sanctioned, whether it be a terrorist organization, a drug cartel, or a state that's sanctioned. Russia finds these sorts of partners to do business with around the world.
Yes, and when we look at Iran itself also has contacts with various organizations around the world. Hezbollah naturally probably being the strongest one, but also the one that is the most international, and also one that has had Israeli citizens in its sight. For example, there was a terrorist attack in Argentina back in the 90s that claimed a lot of Jewish lives. There was another terrorist attack, I believe, in 2008 in Bulgaria and Burgas when they bombed a bus with Jewish tourists, killing a number of them. How big of a threat would you say that these organizations are to Israelis or Jewish people around the world?
Oh, very clearly it's a threat. And I think that's something that's very important to note, is that though all these countries would seem to have dispergent ideologies, they're not going to be somehow connected. The fact is they're all self-interested. So the fact that, let's say North Korea isn't really set on the issue of anti-Semitism as a major issue. That being said, they're happy to work with the Iranians who are promoting that internationally. These different countries specifically do work together. They work carefully together there because they have a common interest, which is to prop up their own regimes. Though their ideologies might be completely divergent, they do have common interests and they do work together on that. And we see that. We see the exporting of terrorism globally as being something that they're willing to engage in because they have no other partners with whom they can work in the world. And that's why we should be very alarmed when we see steps that, even though it seems very far from us, what North Korea is doing towards South Korea is something that actually does relate to Israel. It does relate to the United States, more than just due to our partnerships with these countries. It's because that is going to then involve other states, such as Iran, such as Russia. And then it has greater influence that we will feel around the world.
This war that we see now in Gaza in 2023, now going into 2024, we naturally had other conflicts in Gaza in recent years, even in 2021. There was another big one in 2014. But it does feel that this one that started in 2023 is not just larger in scope than previously, but also it fits into a grander geopolitical struggle. It seems like the world has been going towards this direction for a while, that is basically a new Cold War between two big blocs. You have Russia, China, Iran, North Korea, and through Iran, a number of proxies. You have the Houthis now in Yemen that are trying to close the Suez Canal effectively for international maritime trade. Would you say that this war in some way fits into this larger picture?
Yeah, most certainly. This war is, just one element of a much, much larger picture here. The end all objective of all these different sanctioned nations or organizations or criminal elements, such as the drug cartels, is that they wish to destabilize the world order. Where they see democracies, where they see rule of law, it's not that they're jealous of it, they hate it for some sort of a principled reason. It's much more simple. Where there's rule of law, they can't do business. They are organizations that we have tried to combat. We've tried to make illegal their ability to do business. And so their only way they can win is if they break the international order. So when they see that there's strong U.S. influence, or we see a very strong state of Israel in the region, surrounded by dictators, this is something that is a threat to what their design is. Their design is to be able to do business as they always have, working on the corrupt elites of various countries that allow them to continue to have free reign. And when that's challenged, it's something that they wish to see stopped immediately. And hence, I think, why we see them sparking up tensions, not just here, but globally.
If we're looking at influence operations online, various forms of misinformation, propaganda, it does seem that whatever country is opposing the US in this war has also taken the side of Hamas and Iran. For example, the Chinese or North Koreans, as you mentioned earlier, they don't really have a bone to pick with the Jewish people or Israel on their own. But nevertheless, they seem to actively be taking measures that are against Israel. For example, you had Chinese ships that were sailing in the Red Sea. And when various ships were sending out distress signals that they are under attack by the Houthis, the Chinese just kept on sailing, ignoring any calls, clearly showing that they don't want to engage against the Houthis in any way. How would you say, how is this connection between being anti the US making you also being anti-Israel?
So there is this latch-on effect where we do see that those who have their own beef with the United States, whatever it is, are attracted to whatever is going against the U.S. I think the whole strategy is that if they hope that the United States is being attacked from as many different sides as possible, that might be allows them to break down the U.S.'s control as a superpower. What's interesting about that is that's part of the reason they sponsor terrorism internationally. Why is it that the Soviet Union or the other socialist states sponsored terrorist activities in Africa and Latin America and around the world? It's specifically for that reason. Though just taking over an office building or hijacking an airplane isn't something you would imagine that the Soviet Union would want to encourage. It was something they encouraged because they felt it might break down the U.S.'s ability to control what is happening globally. And that's something that we see still happening today through the support of other radical organizations internationally.
Also, naturally, there were reports from early on, and the Americans also disclosed it in public, that they are sending military aid to Ukraine, everything from 155 millimeter artillery shells to these Tamir missiles for the Iron Dome. Do you believe that these other hostile powers, whether it's Iran or China or Russia, that they have this interest in fueling this war in Gaza for as long as possible to prop up both Hezbollah and Hamas, hoping to draw down American military resources? Even if they don't engage naturally on the ground in Gaza, they are still using missiles either in the Red Sea or sending artillery shells to Israel. And at the same time, we have the war in Ukraine that the Americans have also been sending weapons to for a long time. Are they trying to bleed out our arsenals, so to say?
Well, certainly. I think that Russia gains from the war in Israel today in three different ways. One is, yes, it is bleeding out the arsenal. Secondly, it is distracting the world from what had been earlier a top news story, which was the war in Ukraine. Thirdly, I think that this is another effort that destabilizes international commerce, which is something they want. We see what's happening in the Suez Canal. We see what's going on with the ability to trade. It's been affected by this. And this is something that Russia feels will benefit it all in the end. So Russia is going to do whatever it can to further push the world to be focused on other problems, to spread thin the United States' ability to support its allies. And we were going to see, I think, a worsening of that in the months to come, as Russia has few other options of how it can either win in Ukraine, or really Hamas has very little future here in Israel. So they have to find out other strategies of how they can diversify, let's say, their terrorism at a greater scale internationally.
There's a big question here in Israel right now as well. It seems that the Gaza Strip will be taken by the Israeli army within 2 months or 3 months or so, but it doesn't seem like this is something that could go on for very long. However, there is a debate whether there will be another clash, another conflict with Hezbollah in the north. Do you think that this is something that could be probable?
I think at this point it's unlikely to be a clash with Hezbollah in the north. Of course, it is possible. But I think that if that's the case and there was a serious miscalculation on the part of Hezbollah, they would have been, I think, wiser to strike when the Israelis were as spread out as possible. That being said, there's a lot of unknown factors here. We don't know what else that they're counting on. We don't know what else is being counted on. Listen, Taiwan just had elections where a person who's very strong against working with China is going to be coming to power. This is going to, once again, provoke the situation of what's going on between China and Taiwan, another U.S. major ally. We have the situation of what's going on in Ukraine. As you know, there's been a lot of debate in the United States. It's very unclear what's going to happen next there. We see the instability happening in various Latin American countries, the surge of migration, the surge of drug cartels. Just 3 days ago, a TV station in Ecuador was taken over by a drug cartel. The fact is that the situation in Latin America is highly destabilized. So Russia really is playing a global chessboard. It's not just thinking of specifically what are we going to do with the Houthis or what should we ask the Iranians to do with Hezbollah. It's much more global. It's how do all these dozens of pieces fit together to force the U.S. to be as spread out as possible and to be unable to defend itself. Because once again, every time that there's a victory for one of these terrorist organizations or for one of these countries that's rogue, this is something that Russia feels that the third world, especially the developing world, I should say, looks at and says, it's true. The U.S. is not capable to lead any longer. Europe has lost its role as well. Let's look more towards Russia. And Russia does gain from this. And we can tell. There's polling done in Latin America as well as in Africa that shows that there is much stronger support for Russia than one would ever imagine. So this is all part of a greater strategy that Russia has of how to work with its partners such as Iran, such as North Korea, such as Venezuela, Nicaragua, Cuba, and China to destabilize the United States as a world superpower.
Yeah, especially looking at Africa, if we look at recent years, it does seem that Russia has been taking a lot of terrain, usually at the cost of previous French interests in the Sahel region, but also looking at Russia and the history that they have with Palestine, with Israel, also with the other Arab neighbors in the neighborhood. In 1948, the Soviet Union was quite friendly toward Israel when it was initially created. But by the 50s already, it had taken a significantly different turn. And by the Six-Day War in 1967, the Soviet Union was clearly on the Arab side. How has this influence of the Soviet Union and Russia later on being on their side, how does it fit into the picture of today's war between Israel and Hamas?
So it's fascinating is when you go to, whether it's Africa or it's Latin America, and you ask people, why is it that you think that Russia's on the right side of history, for instance? What do you think is going on? And what's interesting is they will repeat today the same narratives that they did 40 years ago or 60 years ago, which is that Russia always had this, communist ideology, which is that the working class is being oppressed and they're going to be liberated, or it's the colonizers trying to take over this population and they need to be liberated. Now, what we see going on today is that same narrative is being used in terms of Israel. Russian state media does help promote this narrative that what is going on in the case of Palestine is that these are an oppressed population. The colonizers, in this case would be the Israelis, are being forced out or they're trampling over these poor Palestinians. Now, why do they use that narrative? And it's more than the fact that it's just a very easy one to use. It's because it's so deeply ingrained. When you've been repeating the same narrative for decades and decades and decades, people are already on the lookout for it. They're already waiting to see the signs that that's what's occurring because it's very easy. There has to be the good guy and the bad guy. It's just the general trend that they always see. So in this case, they're trying to find that. And it's not so simple as that. Unfortunately, though, Russian media does make it that simple. And that is what they repeat over and over and over again if you listen to things such as Russia Today.
Yeah, Russia Today also, it has to be said that they had Russia Today in Spanish, in various other languages. It was available in the US very widely. So when you see these university students, college campuses across the US, where you have a large percent of the student body seemingly taking very anti-American positions, is this also an effect of this Soviet propaganda that had been, the foundation was laid back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s?
I think most certainly. I mean, the fact is that students today are, I'd say, almost programmed to be looking for a few classic things. We look back at a lot of things that truly were atrocious in U.S. history, whether it be slavery or the segregation or other things like this. And they say, that was terrible. And the good guys were those who liberated the slaves or those who fought for civil rights. Those are the good guys and the bad guys. So it makes it very clear. But who is that today? So you're trying to find an analogy, but maybe there isn't an analogy. Maybe things are just different. Maybe it's not the same situation, but they're trying to identify that. But then when you see the protest, you look at who's going to them. You look at the names of the organizations, and you look back at the history, and sure enough, there's Soviet ties. Because the Soviet Union is reusing the same narratives that it always has, again and again and again. And I think that, yes, there is a lot of Soviet, or I should say, actually, it was Soviet influence. Today, it's with Russia's help as well. But these are things that have their origin decades ago. These are not new narratives. These are very old narratives.
Yeah, the narratives, for example, we often hear now on college campuses that Israel is the last colonial state, that this is a struggle of decolonization. Another is, of course, accusing Israel of being an apartheid state. So it does seem that they are trying to mold this war into their preconceived narratives that worked on previous issues. At the same time, there are some special relations between Russia and Israel as well. After the fall of the Soviet Union, it was a very large stream of migration from the Soviet Union, naturally most of them being Soviet Jews, but also some non-Jews that also made their way here. And when the war erupted in Ukraine, there was some debate whether Ukraine would be able to receive help from Israel. At the same time, in Israel, they said that we need close relations with the Russians because we are flying in over Syria from time to time. The Russians have air defense systems over there. Do you think that this relation between Israel and Russia will change due to the fallout from this war?
I mean, it'll eventually have to change. The fact is it will. Unfortunately, Israel is in an incredibly complicated situation because I would be the last person to advise someone to talk to Russia. That would be the last thing I would suggest for any country in this world. Israel, though, look at who its neighbors are. Who else has relationships with, let's say, Iran, who could readily reach out to Iran? This is something that, unfortunately, the United States certainly cannot help with that. The European allies are probably not a great help with that. But ultimately, Russia has its interests, not just in Israel, but the entire region. And its interest, though, is more important than simply what's going on. Once again, it's not just the act of what's happening today, it's the bigger picture. This is one more lever that Russia can play with. This is one more thing that it can use. What's fascinating to me is I recently was reading about the degree that Hezbollah receives financing from gold sales from Latin America, namely Venezuela. You look at the degree that there is recruitment for Hezbollah in the Cone in Latin America. You look at the degree that there's been a surge of money laundering that takes place from the drug cartels cooperating with Venezuela and as well as with Iran, namely in countries such as Colombia, such as Ecuador, and they're washing money through Russian banks. That then goes on to finance international terrorism. This is all interrelated. So it's not just the one-time thing or the specific case. It's how does this fit into a general ecosystem of crime and terrorism. Ultimately, Vladimir Putin is not really a president. He's sort of the copy. He's the head of the mafia. And the mafia is engaged in tons of different types of criminal behaviors, whether it's murder or extortion or drug trade or money laundering. They're all tied to each other. And one of the instruments they use is terrorism.
When it comes to October 7th, it does seem that Israelis generally agree on the fact that they were caught unprepared. They didn't see it coming. Hamas certainly had that surprise effect on October 7th that worked to their advantage. However, Hamas is a non-state actor. They have been in control of the Gaza Strip since 2005, and they have been in dire need of money to be able to prepare their military capabilities, build all these tunnels and so on. Where do you think they have been getting their money from, and have some of that financing been coming not only from other Arab states such as Qatar and Saudi Arabia, which was maybe the Palestinians received more money from those countries, at least from Saudi Arabia back in the 90s. Later on, when the Americans told them to lay it off, they kind of did and moved back. Qatar has still been providing it, but Iran has been the major source of income for Hamas. Do you think that Iran might have been given some aid as well from Russia when it comes to the financial side of it, or even the military side with weapons?
I have no doubt there is cooperation. And actually, I'll cite for you a story. Just a couple of years ago, I was in a meeting with the head of an intelligence service in Latin America. And we were discussing what was going on at that moment in the country. And he said, today was an unusually bad day at work. And I asked what happened. And he said, we have a group that's showing up to the border of 72 military officers from Venezuela. They're plain dressed, but when they entered the country, we ran them through a database. We recognized them to be military officers. At the same time, there was about 5 or 6 Iranians who entered the country who we recognized to be money launderers, professional money launderers. Very experienced, going back decades, having lived in Europe and other places, but serious professionals. They're all headed towards the border region. And I asked what they're doing there. He said they're meeting with various groups who are the equivalent of something like FARC, let's say, which FARC is no longer what it used to be, but it's a well-known organization that was radical, communist ideology, Marxist ideology, had very strong ties to the Soviet Union, but in fact, it was a drug cartel. I mean, it was dealing with narcotics. But why were they there in the border region meeting? According to the head of the intelligence service, he said, well, they've got different roles. The role of the Venezuelans is to transport drugs, whether it's to the United States or to Europe. It's to be the guys who are doing the infrastructure, let's say. Then you have the logistics. Then you have the other side of this, which is the money laundering, which is, once again, it's a skill. I mean, it's not easy to figure out how to wash billions of dollars because all these organizations have something in common. If you're Russia or if you're Iran or if you're FARC or if you're the guy who's selling drugs, you're dealing with cash. You're not dealing with banks. You have a serious problem of trying to deal with international monetary finance. But fortunately, cash can be used anywhere in the world, as can drugs have a value everywhere in the world, and guns have a value everywhere in the world. So they're dealing with things that do have a value. But the Iranians were figuring out how to wash that money and send it back. Now, once again, FARC and these other organizations, similar organizations, had ties to the Soviet Union. Today, that continues. They do have ties to things like the Russian Federation. So they are all working together. But what's fascinating is, because that money is dirty money, where does it go next? Well, these drug organizations, they do receive guns, they do receive other help like that. But for the terrorist organizations, they receive money. Because this is a way you can get rid of tons of money, cash, at one time, through things like terrorist organizations, non-state actors who you can finance. So there is an exchange of goods, a bartering system that exists, but it's all interrelated.
When it comes to war in the Middle East, it also seems that Hamas has been on the back foot when it comes to international politics in recent years. You had the Abraham Accord signed. There was this general trend of many Arab countries trying to normalize their relations with Israel, increase economic bonds between their states. And now it seems that through this war, Hamas is in some way sacrificing the civilian people in Gaza in order to try to rile up the so-called Arab street for them to rebel against their governments, which are more prone to work together with Israel. Is there a general plan to create as much chaos as possible in the Middle East, in North Africa? See war in the region, see regimes toppled, civil wars. There are also those who say that this will create larger waves of migration to Europe, and Russia has naturally been trying to separate Europe from the transatlantic alliance, so to say, and have Europe align more with Russia. If there would be a larger percentage of the European population being of migrant background from North Africa and the Middle East, then maybe they would be more attracted to Russia as well. Is this too complex of a plan and I'm getting too far away, or is this something that could be possible?
I think it makes perfect sense. The objective remains the same. It's to create chaos and destroy the world order. So whatever can be done to break that down, whatever can be done to create more pandemonium, where people are no longer able to focus, it's not clear what's going to happen next, and all of a sudden Russia or its allies might look like they might be the strong partners to rely on. That's what they want. Keep in mind how many countries that are weak, that realize that they're not stable, might turn to Russia or turn to Iran and say, please don't destabilize us, we'll make a deal, realizing that the U.S. is probably not going to step up. Whereas Russia is willing to dispatch, let's say, Wagner Group, or its equivalents now, in order to secure your regime. Russia does operate that way. And so it is sort of like a mafia. If you don't buy the insurance, bad things can happen.
If you look at Israel's geopolitical position, there are those who say that Israel is under immense pressure because there is this saying that Israel needs to win every war, while its Arabic neighbors need to only win one war. So naturally, Israel, even though this is not official, but it seems that everybody agree on this, that Israel naturally has nuclear weapons. They have a very capable army. But at the same time, it is a fairly small state geographically. Its population isn't big compared to this sea of neighbors. Do you think Israel will be able to build peaceful relations with maybe not the Palestinians themselves, but with these other Arab neighbors with whom they've had wars previously?
I think that the greatest hope is going to rely on the fact that the neighbors, especially the non-democratic neighbors, are all motivated by self-interest. They want to stay in power. So if they think that Israel can actually pose a threat to that, if Israel can be something that will no longer allow them to maintain peace within their own country, that's something that might motivate them. They're not going to do it out of ideology or because it's right. They're going to do it because they realize it's no longer behooves them to create problems within Israel.
Also, again, returning to Hezbollah and Iran, the Houthis seem to have been much more prone to take risks than Hezbollah has so far. And there is this debate on how close the connection is between Iran and the Houthis, whether the Houthis are acting on behalf of Iran when they are attacking these various vessels in the Red Sea, or whether this is just a Houthi project. Do you think that they are crazy enough, so to say, to do it, or is this something that they are being ordered to do from Tehran?
I think the Houthis are being ordered. I don't think they're doing this by their own natural spirit. And they're being encouraged by Iran, who hopes to see what happens next. I mean, it's a very good investment for Iran, really, because Iran itself is technically not taking any risk. It's not the Houthis, who I think that they're not so passionate about. Hezbollah is much more of an interest for them. So if the Houthis get wiped out in U.S. airstrikes, it's a loss, but it's not the end of the world. And so I think for them, it's just sort of trying to find out where is that red line for the Americans, how far can they go, and to see and to test what it is the U.S. and its allies are willing to tolerate or are willing to stand up to.
Also, if you look at Israeli-European relations, it seems that the Germans are actually the only state who, due to their history naturally, have not taken this anti-Israeli position that many other states in Europe have. Where would you say that the trend is going when it comes to European and Israeli relations?
Unfortunately, I think it's the same as the United States. I think it's a generational shift. We see that in polling in the United States, and it's shifted tremendously over the past 2 decades especially. And I think we see the same thing occurring in Europe. Europeans are not viewing it the same as they used to. They identify less with Israel. What occurred already 3 generations ago is already 3 generations ago or more. And it's not something that they as readily find solace in as a need to support. And so I think it's going to be increasingly difficult for Israel to count on the support of its allies. And it is all the more justification for why Israel needs to find new ways, innovative ways, to justify why it is important that the West stand behind it and support it.
Yeah, you mentioned that there is this generational divide, which seems to be very clear when you look at American campuses, university campuses. Why exactly do you think that the youth has been so lured into this position that for some reason Israel is evil while Hamas actually isn't that bad of a group?
It's pretty incredible, but I think that ultimately there's a couple of reasons. One is because I think that a lot of youths, especially the far left, already in their minds have such a painted picture that the U.S. has been on the wrong side of history so many times. Whether it was the U.S. that was pushing segregation, or the U.S. who was involved in slavery, or the U.S. who interned Japanese in World War II, whatever it was, that the U.S. was the bad guy. And today when they look at foreign policy and they see what's going on, they say, well, the U.S. behind Israel, and here it is, the colonizers, the Israelis, who are there oppressing these Palestinians. It's the whites against the ones that are not white. And once again, the U.S. is on the wrong side of history. And I think that they wish to identify this very romantic vision that they're fighting from sort of great civil rights. Of course, it's totally divorced from the reality of what's occurring. But I think that's ultimately how they see it in their own minds. Because we're also going to find that sort of classic struggle that they're seeking. It doesn't exist. I mean, at least as far as the U.S. goes. But they try to recreate it now at campuses.
We have been talking about the threat that is posed by the far left in the U.S. Against that special relationship that the U.S. and Israel have and have had for a long time. But there also seems to be a growing threat on the right. Naturally, the Republican Party is more prone to be pro-Israel. But on that furthest part of the spectrum to the right, there seems to be a growing sentiment that Israel is somehow not a good partner for the US, that actually Israel has some nefarious plans against the US. And then you have another part of the Republican Party, which is maybe it's not against Israel, but it's more turning towards general isolationism from world affairs, that they believe that America cannot be the world policeman at all, and they should just withdraw back to the North American continent and not even stick their nose out. How would you describe this threat that could be emerging on the right as well?
I think the greatest threat facing the right today is this America first mentality, which is not the first time in our history by any means. We had the same thing happen during World War I, during World War II. And whenever this starts to breed, we have more problems internationally. The fact is, it's impossible to have a vacuum in nature. It's going to be filled by something. And when the United States steps out, it doesn't mean that now there's going to be just this harmony. In fact, it means other countries or other actors will get involved, whether that's Iran or China or another state. But in the case of the United States today, I see this desire to step back, including what's happening in Israel, as being part and symptomatic of a larger desire that the U.S. takes itself out of the equation of what's happening in world events and rather focuses on domestic issues. And the polling would indicate that is certainly increasing, and increasing quickly over the last few years.
Also, this isolationist movement is naturally getting full support from Russian state propaganda. And if the Russians believe that something is good for America, then probably it isn't really good for America. So would you say that this is also a narrative that is being pushed by the Russians?
Most certainly. One of the things that Russia's always push is the idea that, listen, America, you have your own problems, deal with your own domestic issues first. Don't focus on what's happening in other countries. And part of the strategy there is obviously not because Russia's trying to help the Americans. It simply wants the U.S. to take itself off the world stage. And that's what it's doing here. You know, when Russia's pushing things such as de-armament, or it's pushing things that would pull the United States out of NATO, it's not because they're trying to help create world peace. They're doing it specifically because they realize it would make the United States weaker and weaken our allies, especially the Europeans. And this is what Russia is pushing. And they're pushing it all the time for now decades. Unfortunately, I think many people do not realize those slogans that they're repeating are not just coming out of thin air. They're not as apropos today as they might think. Those might be the very same slogans that were repeated already 4 or 5 decades ago.
Also, if we look at this conflict, where would you say that it is going within the next few years? How has this affected general world geopolitics? What would have been the difference if this war never broke out?
I think the outbreak of this war is significant, and it's significant for a few reasons. One is that I think that it is changing the dynamics of what's going on in Middle East peace, but I think there's perhaps something I'm even more concerned by, frankly, which is the fact that the United States did not come through for Israel, as it did not come through for Ukraine. As of today, it appears that the United States will not pass any more support for Ukraine or for Israel until after the presidential elections, which is in November. And that's quite shocking. It means the United States can no longer be counted on. And this is probably the worst green light that could possibly be given to a number of actors, whether it is Iran and what might happen next here with Hezbollah in the north, what that means for Taiwan. This is happening at probably the worst moment in history that it could happen. And unfortunately, due to domestic political games, which is actually a very small number of the total number of congressmen, but they have enough of a say, enough power, enough leverage to be able to dictate what Congress does. And that, I think, might have dire consequences for the entire world.
And how important would you say that U.S. aid, whether military or diplomatic or in any other form, is for Israel?
It's obviously very important. And the United States has been a very strong ally of Israel since the very beginning. And the relationship has always been very strong. And if you look at the polling, just a few years ago, the U.S. support for Israel was overwhelming. Today, we've seen it drop down. I mean, now it's less than 50% of Americans want to support Israel. And that's quite shocking. That's a sign that times have changed. So Israel does require that help, but Israel must be doing more to show Americans why that's necessary, why it is in the United States' interest, not just obviously Israel's interest, but why is it the United States' interest to support Israel, the common enemies that we face, and how working together will have a better benefit for both of us.
Jason, many thanks for coming on.
Thank you.